The transport ship descended through the orange clouds of Threl's Prime, carrying 67 nervous cadets from 12 different species. Through the viewport windows, they could see the massive structure of the Galactic Defense Academy rising from the rocky plains below. It was a place of legend where the finest military minds of the Coalition learned to work together and protect the peace that had lasted for 3,000 years. Among the cadets was a young Danny named Prelox. He pressed his webbed hands against the cold glass and watched the academy grow larger. His gills fluttered with excitement. His people were amphibious with smooth blue skin and large dark eyes designed for seeing in deep water. He had trained his entire life for this moment. His father had served in the Coalition fleet and his grandfather before him. Now it was his turn to bring honor to his family. Sitting beside him was a Seath called Crystalline Fragment 7. The Seath were beings made of living mineral, their bodies formed from geometric crystals that caught and reflected light. When they spoke, their voices sounded like wind chimes. Fragment 7 was nervous too, though it was hard to tell from looking at them. Their crystal surface simply vibrated at a slightly higher frequency than normal. Across the aisle sat a group of V cadets. The VR were insected beings with 4 arms, compound eyes, and delicate wings folded against their backs. They clicked and buzzed to each other in their native language, pointing at things outside the window. One of them, a female named Kirix, noticed Prelox watching and gave him a friendly wave with 2 of her arms. But there were 3 cadets who sat apart from the others. They were in the far back corner of the transport, speaking quietly among themselves. Prelox had never seen their species before. They had soft skin in various shades of brown and pink, hair on their heads, and only 2 arms and 2 legs. They were smaller than most species on the ship, with no natural armor, no claws, no wings, and no obvious weapons built into their bodies. What are those? Fragment 7 asked, their chimes soft with curiosity. Humans, Prelox answered. He had read about them in his preparation materials. They joined the Coalition 18 cycles ago. They come from a small planet called Earth. They look fragile, Kirix said, having moved closer to listen. How did they even achieve space travel? Prelox did not know the answer. The humans did look fragile. The female among them, who had light brown hair pulled back from her face, noticed the alien staring. She did not look away or seem embarrassed. She simply met their eyes with a calm, steady gaze that made Prelox feel strangely uncomfortable. Then she returned to her conversation with the 2 human males beside her. The transport landed with a gentle bump, and the cadets filed out onto the landing platform. The air of Threl's Prime was thin and dry, with a faint smell of sulfur. Coalition species from dozens of worlds milled about, some in uniform, others in the simple gray clothing of new arrivals. A booming voice cut through the noise. New cadets form ranks in the central courtyard. Commander Zri will address you shortly. They followed the signs in the flow of bodies until they reached a massive open space surrounded by tall buildings. Nearly 112 cadets gathered there, arranging themselves in neat rows. Prelox found himself standing near the front with Fragment 7 on one side and Kirix on the other. The 3 humans stood in the very back row, almost invisible among the largest species. Commander Zthrix arrived through a side Door, he was a Vil, but of much larger than any of the Vil cadets. His wings were a deep purple color, marking him as a veteran of many campaigns. His compound eyes swept across the assembled cadets, seeming to see each one individually. "Welcome to the Galactic Defense Academy," he said. His voice was translated through devices that each cadet wore, turning his clicks and buzzes into words they could understand. "You have been chosen from billions of candidates across the coalition. You represent the future of interstellar peacekeeping. Over the next 4 cycles, you will learn to fight, to lead, and to protect the peace that our ancestors built." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This semester we study the military histories of all coalition species. You will learn how each member world approaches warfare, what strategies they employ, and what lessons their conflicts can teach us. Today we begin with humanity." A murmur passed through the crowd. Prolox exchanged confused looks with Fragment 7. Humanity. They were the newest and most primitive species in the coalition. Their home world had only developed faster than light travel within the last century. What could they possibly teach advanced civilizations about warfare? "I see your confusion," Zarex continued. "Many of you are wondering why we would begin with such a young species. The answer is simple. In all my years of military study, I have never encountered a species quite like humanity. Their history is brief by galactic standards, approximately 10,000 of their years, yet in that time they have engaged in more armed conflicts than the Dani have in 200,000 years. Prolix felt his gills clamp shut in shock. That was impossible. That was impossible. The Dorani were one of the oldest species in the coalition. They had fought countless wars before. Finding peace, for humans to have exceeded that number in such a short time, was beyond belief. Surely that is an exaggeration, Commander. Prolox heard himself say. The words came out before he could stop them. Zithri turned his compound eyes toward the young Dani. "It is not cadet. Humans have documented over 15,000 armed conflicts in their recorded history. They have invented weapons capable of destroying their entire planet multiple times over. They have killed hundreds of millions of their own kind." The courtyard fell completely silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. In the back row, the human female stood perfectly still. Her name was Lieutenant Katie Brennan, and she had known this moment was coming. The human ambassador had warned her and her fellow humans that this day would be difficult. The galaxy was about to learn what humanity really was, and not everyone would be able to handle the truth. "We will now proceed to the viewing hall," Zithri announced. "There you will observe archival footage from human conflicts. I must caution you, what you are about to see has not been edited for sensitive viewers. If any of you wish to leave at any point, you may do so without penalty. There is no shame in recognizing your limits." As the cadets began to move toward the viewing hall, Prolox noticed that Katie Brennan had not moved. She was watching the alien cadets file past her with an expression he could not read. It might have been sadness, it might have been resignation, or it might have been something else entirely. Prolox did not know it yet, but his understanding of the universe was about to change forever. The viewing hall was a massive circular room with seats rising in tiers around a central holographic display. The walls were dark, designed to absorb light and focused attention on whatever was being shown. 112 cadets took their seats, their voices dropping to whispers as the doors sealed shut behind them. Prolak sat between Fragment 7 and Kirix, his heart beating faster than normal. He told himself there was nothing to worry about. He had seen war footage before. The Dani had their own bloody history, their own ancient conflicts. Whatever the humans had done could not be so different from what other species had experienced. Commander Zithri stood at the edge of the central display, his purple wings folded tight against his back. Before we begin, I want to provide context. Humans evolved on a world with limited resources and harsh conditions. Their early history was marked by constant competition for food, water, and territory. Unlike many coalition species, they did not have a single global government until very recently. For most of their history, they were divided into hundreds of separate nations, each with its own military. He pressed a control on his wrist device, and the lights dimmed further. The holographic display flickered to life. We begin with what humans call the First World War. It took place approximately 110 of their years ago. The first images appeared. They were flat and two-dimensional, captured in shades of gray and white. Prelux leaned forward, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Trenches, long deep cuts in the muddy ground stretching as far as the eye could see. Thousands of humans crouched inside them, dressed in heavy clothing and metal helmets. Their faces were covered in dirt. Their eyes looked hollow and exhausted. Then the footage changed. The humans were climbing out of the trenches, carrying weapons in their hands. They ran forward across an open field toward another set of trenches. In the distance, flashes of light erupted. From the far side, the running humans began to fall one by one, then in groups, then in waves. They fell and did not get up. They are running directly in the weapon's fire. Kirix whispered, her wings trembling. Why would they do that? The footage continued. Explosions tore through the earth, sending bodies flying through the air. The mud was no longer brown, it was red. Prolux felt his stomach's turn. He had seen violence before, but this was different. This was not a battle between two armies. This was slaughter on an industrial scale. Humans were dying by the hundreds, by the thousands, and still more came climbing out of the trenches to take their place. Then the footage showed something even worse. A yellow-green cloud rolled across the battlefield. Pushed by the wind, the humans began to choke and claw at their faces. They fell to the ground, convulsing, foam pouring from their mouths. They are using poison gas, Zithri explained. Chemical weapon designed to burn the lungs and blind the eyes. Both sides used it against each other. Fragment 7 made a high-pitched sound of distress, their crystal body vibrating so hard that the cadets sitting nearby could feel it. They poisoned their own atmosphere while they were standing in it. From the back of the room, a human voice spoke. It was Katie Brennan, the female lieutenant. Her voice was calm and flat, as if she were reciting facts from a textbook. The First World War lasted 4 years. 17 million humans died. Another 23 million were wounded. Some of the soldiers spent months living in those trenches, surrounded by mud and rats and the bodies of their friends. Many of the survivors were never the same again. The room was silent except for the sounds of the footage. Prolux found he could not look away even though every part of him wanted to. The holographic display shifted. The images were now in color, sharper and clearer than before. This is the second world war, Zurich said. It began approximately 20 years after the first one ended. Tanks rolled through burning cities. Aircraft filled the sky, dropping bombs that turned buildings into rubble and fire. Soldiers fought in streets and fields and forests. The dead were everywhere, bodies stacked in piles, bodies floating in rivers, bodies hanging from trees. But it was the next sequence that broke something in the viewing hall. On the footage showed a single aircraft flying high above a city. A small object fell from its belly, tumbling toward the buildings below. Then there was a flash of light, so bright that the holographic display struggled to render it. When the light faded, there was nothing left. The city was gone. In its place was a cloud, shaped like a mushroom, rising miles into the sky. This is a nuclear weapon, Zurich said, a device that splits atoms to release enormous amounts of energy. This single bomb killed approximately 80,000 humans instantly. Tens of thousands more died in the following weeks from burns and radiation sickness. Prolox heard a sound beside him. Kirix was crying, tears leaking from her compound eyes. All around the room, cadets were reacting with horror. Several VR had already fled, their wings buzzing in panic as they sought the exits. They used that weapon twice, another human voice said. This one belonged to Sergeant Cole Murphy, a tall male with short dark hair and a scar on his chin. His voice was as flat as Katie Bren's had been, both times on civilian population centers, cities full of families and children. They calculated that it would end the war faster and save more lives in the long run, so they chose the quicker horror over the slower one. That is how humans think about war. The third human added. His name was Corporal Danny Vance, and he was the youngest of the three. His face was pale, but his voice did not shake. We count the bodies and pick the smaller number. We do math with human lives and choose the option that kills fewer people, even if that option is a nightmare. Commander Zri paused the footage. The mushroom cloud hung frozen in the air, a monument to destruction on a scale that most coalition species had never imagined. We will take a short break, Zurich announced. Those who need to leave may do so. We will continue in 1 hour. The lights came up. Prolox sat frozen in his seat, unable to move. His mind was struggling to process what he had just seen. Danny had fought wars. Yes, they had killed each other in ancient times, but nothing like this, nothing on this scale. He looked toward the back of the room where the three humans still sat. They had not moved. They had watched the footage of their own species' atrocities with faces that showed no surprise, no shock, no denial. They had known. They had always known. And this, Prolox realized with a cold feeling spreading through his body, was only the beginning. The footage had covered less than 50 years of human history. There were thousands more years to go. For the first time in his life, Prolux understood what it meant to be truly afraid. The footage continued over the following days. Each morning the cadets would gather in the viewing hall. Each morning there were fewer of them. By the second day, 23 cadets had submitted withdrawal requests. By the third day, the number had grown to 41. The viewing hall, which had felt crowded on the First day now had empty sections where no one wanted to sit. Pelox forced himself to return each time. He did not know why. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps it was the stubborn Danny refusal to admit weakness, or perhaps it was something else, a need to understand, a need to know what humans truly were. The footage showed wars that came after the nuclear bombings. Humans had not learned peace from their terrible weapons. They had simply found new ways to fight. There was a war in a place called Vietnam. Soldiers moved through thick green forests, never knowing when the enemy might appear. They burned villages. They dropped chemicals that made the trees die and fall. They killed each other with traps hidden in the ground and explosions triggered by trip wires. There were wars in deserts. Machines rolled across the sand and missiles fell from the sky like rain. There were wars in cities where soldiers fought building by building, room by room, kicking down doors and shooting at shadows. There were bombs that could be hidden in cars, in bags, in the clothing of people who walked into crowded markets and chose to die so they could take others with them. The CIA cadets were the first entire species to withdraw. Their crystalline bodies were not built to process this kind of horror. Fragment 7 was the last of them to leave. Before they went, they stopped beside Prolog's seat. I cannot continue. Fragment 7 chimed softly. Every time I close my perception nodes, I see the mushroom cloud. I see the bodies. I hear the screaming. How do you bear it, Pelox? I do not know, Pelox admitted. I just keep watching. But why? Prolox had no answer. Fragment 7 left and the Danny was alone. During the meal period on the third day, Prolox saw Katie Brennan sitting by herself at a table in the corner of the food hall. She was eating something from a small container, her movement slow and mechanical, without really deciding to do so. Prolox walked over and stood across from her. May I sit? He asked. Katie looked up at him. Her eyes were a color he had never seen before on any species, a pale blue-gray like shallow water over sand. She nodded once and returned to her meal. Pelox sat down. For a long moment he said nothing. He did not know how to begin. Finally, he spoke the question that had been burning in his mind since the first day. How do you bear it, knowing your species has done these things? Katie set down her eating utensil. She looked at Prolox with that same steady gaze he had noticed on the transport ship. How do I bear it? She repeated. Prelu, my grandfather fought in one of those wars. My mother served in another. I am here because generations of my family bled so that I can have a chance at something better than what they had. But the brutality, Prel said, the cruelty, how can you accept that this is what you are? Because pretending it did not happen would be worse. Katie leaned forward, her voice soft but intense. Every human child learns these histories. We show them the footage. We take them to the places where the bombs fell and the bodies were buried. We make them understand that this is what happens when diplomacy fails, when hatred takes over, when people stop seeing each other as people. Prolox's gills fluttered with confusion. You traumatize your young with images of death. We educate them. There's a difference. Katie shook her head slowly. A human who has never seen what war really looks like might be eager to start one. They might think it is glorious or exciting or noble, but a human who has seen the footage, who has walked through the memorials, who has listened to the survivors tell their Stories that human understands that war is the last resort, and if you have to fight, you fight to end it as quickly as possible, but you keep fighting. Prolox pressed. The footage shows wars that happened after the nuclear weapons. Your species saw what those bombs could do, and you still kept having wars. Katie's face did something complicated that Prolox could not read. Yes, we kept fighting because the causes of war did not disappear just because the weapons got more terrible. People still hated each other. Nations still wanted what other nations had. Leaders still sent young people to die for ideas and flags and borders on maps. She paused. But we also kept trying to stop. Every war ended eventually. Every enemy became an ally eventually. We built organizations to prevent conflicts, to punish those who committed atrocities, to help rebuild what was destroyed. And did it work? Sometimes. Not always. Katie looked down at her hands. We are not a perfect species. Prolox, we are violent and cruel and capable of terrible things, but we are also capable of recognizing our own cruelty and choosing to be better. That is what the footage is really about. Not just what we did, but what we learned from doing it. That evening, 43 more cadets submitted withdrawal requests. The viewing hall was now less than half full. Commander Zithri noted the numbers without comment and continued the lessons. Prolox remained. He did not know if Katie's words had convinced him of anything, but they had given him something to think about. Humans were not mindless monsters. They were something more complicated, something that scared him in ways he could not fully explain. They were a species that had looked into the darkness of their own nature and had not looked away. They carried that darkness with them, not as a source of pride, but as a warning, and Prolux was beginning to understand that this was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. By the final day of the Human History module, only 37 cadets remained out of the original 112. The viewing hall felt enormous now, the empty seats a silent testimony to what the footage had done. Those who stayed sat closer together as if drawing comfort from each other's presence. Prolox looked around at the survivors. Kirix was still there, though her wings had not stopped trembling since the second day. A handful of VR remained, their compound eyes dull with exhaustion. A few Danny sat scattered through the tears, their faces grim, and in the back row, as always, the three humans sat in perfect stillness. Commander Zithri entered the hall and took his position by the holographic display. He looked at the diminished class for a long moment before speaking. Those of you who remain have shown exceptional courage, he said. What you have witnessed over these past days would break many experienced soldiers. Yet you are still here. I want you to remember this feeling. Remember what it took to stay. This is the first lesson humanity has taught you, though you may not realize it yet. He activated the display, but the footage that appeared was different from what they had seen before. It was not warfare. It was aftermath. The images showed soldiers in dirty uniforms standing in lines handing out food to crowds of thin and hungry civilians. Medics worked in field hospitals treating wounded people who wore the uniforms of the enemy. Trucks delivered supplies to bombed out cities, and workers cleared rubble from streets that had been battlefields just days before. This is also human warfare. Xerix explained. They destroy with terrible efficiency, but they also Rebuilt, watched the footage shifted. Now, it showed courtrooms where men in suits sat behind long tables facing men in prisoners' clothing. Documents were presented, testimony was given, verdicts were delivered. After their great wars, humans created systems to hold their own people accountable for atrocities. They put their own generals and leaders on trial. They collected evidence and recorded testimonies. They made sure the world knew exactly what had happened and who was responsible. Pralix felt something strange stirring in his chest. He had expected more horror, more violence, more death. This was something else entirely. The footage continued. Former enemies sat across tables from each other signing documents. Hands were shaken, flags were raised. Children played in streets that had been ruins a generation earlier. Old soldiers who had once tried to kill each other met and embraced, tears streaming down their aged faces. Crystal and fragment. Seven's question from days ago echoed in Prelux's mind. Now Kirix asked aloud, her voice barely above a whisper, they forgive. Cole Murphy stood from his seat. In the back, his face was tired and there were shadows under his eyes, but his voice was strong. Not exactly. We remember every name, every atrocity, every mistake. We build monuments to our failures so we never forget them. We write books and make films and create museums dedicated to the worst things we have ever done. He paused, looking around at the remaining cadets. But we also believe that people can change. Nations can change. The enemies of one generation become the allies of the next. If we do not believe that, we would have wiped ourselves out centuries ago. The nuclear weapons gave us the power to destroy our entire planet. We chose not to use them again. Kirix raised a trembling hand. You fight like demons and then offer peace. How can both things be true? Danny Vance stood beside Cole. He was the youngest of the human cadets, but in that moment he looked older than his years. We offer peace first, always first. We do not want war. Our species has seen too much of it, lost too much to it. Every human alive today has ancestors who died. Wars, we carry that weight in our bones. He took a breath before continuing. But if war comes to us, if someone threatens what we love and will not accept peace, then we make sure they never want to threaten us again. We fight with everything we have. We use every weapon, every strategy, every advantage. We do not stop until the threat is ended, and then when the fighting is done, we put down our weapons and reach out our hands. Katie Brennan stood as well. The three humans faced the remaining cadets like witnesses at a trial. This is what we want you to understand, Katie said. The footage you have seen is not a source of pride for us. It is a warning. We show you our history not to frighten you, but to teach you war is not a game. It is not glory or honor or adventure. It is suffering and death and broken families and burned cities. It is children growing up without parents and parents burying their children. Her voice grew quieter but no less intense. We humans know this better than anyone. We have done terrible things to each other, but we have also survived those terrible things. We have rebuilt. We have forgiven, not by forgetting but by remembering and choosing to move forward. Anyway, that is the lesson. That is what we can teach you. Commander Xerix let the silence stretch out for a long moment. Then he spoke again, his voice thoughtful. In my many years of service, I have studied the military histories of over 40 species. I have seen empires rise and fall. I have watched civilizations tear themselves apart and others find lasting peace, but I have never encountered a species quite like humanity. He turned to face the human. Cadets directly, you are young by galactic standards, your technology is primitive compared to most coalition species. You have no natural weapons, no armor, no obvious advantages. And yet you have survived things that would have destroyed other species. You have looked into your own darkness and emerged stronger. Xerix looked back at the remaining cadets. This is why we study human warfare first, not because they are the strongest or the most advanced, but because they understand something that many older species have forgotten. They understand the true cost of violence, and they carry that understanding with them always. The footage ended, the lights came up, and for the first time since the module began, the viewing hall was not filled with horror or fear. It was filled with something that felt almost like respect. 1 year had passed since the human history module. The orange clouds of Thrells Prime drifted across the sky as cadets and families gathered for the graduation ceremony. Flags from dozens of coalition worlds hung from the academy walls, rippling in the dry wind. The class had changed much since that first day, nearly half withdrawn during the human history module alone, making it the highest dropout rate in the Academy's long history. But the cadets who remained had become something different. They had forged bonds that crossed species lines. They had trained together, studied together, and faced challenges that would have broken lesser soldiers, and they had never forgotten what they learned in that viewing hall. Prologue stood at the front of the assembled graduates wearing the crisp blue uniform of a coalition lieutenant. His Danny gills fluttered with nervous energy. He had been chosen to give the commencement speech, an honor that still surprised him. A year ago he had been a confused young cadet who could not understand why the Academy would waste time on primitive human history. Now he understood. He looked out at the crowd. His family sat in the visitor section, his father's dark eyes shining with pride. Other graduates stood in neat rows behind him, representing a dozen different species, and in the back, as always, stood the 3 human cadets: Katie Brennan, Cole Murphy, Danny Vance. They had graduated at the top of their tactical classes, surprising no one who had gotten to know them. Prolox took a deep breath and began to speak. 1 year ago, I sat in a viewing hall and watched footage that changed my life. I saw cities burned to ash. I saw millions of beings killed by weapons I could not imagine. I saw a species that had done terrible things to itself over and over again for thousands of years, and I wanted to run. He paused, letting the memories wash over him. Many of my fellow cadets did run. They left the Academy because they could not bear to watch anymore. I do not blame them. What we saw was horrible beyond description. For days afterward I could not sleep. I could not eat. I kept seeing the mushroom cloud every time I closed my eyes. The crowd was silent, hanging on his words, but I stayed. Because I needed to understand. I needed to know what kind of beings could do such things and still call themselves civilized. I needed to know if humans were monsters that the Coalition had made a terrible mistake in accepting. Prooks looked toward the back of the crowd, finding Katie Brennan's pale eyes, she gave him a small nod of encouragement. What I found was something I never expected. Humans are not monsters, they are survivors. They are a species that learned to harness its own capacity for violence and aim it with purpose. They fight not because they love war, but because they love what they are protecting more than they fear what they are facing. He turned to address the graduates directly. Every one of us who remained in this program watched the same footage. We saw the same horrors, and we made a choice. We chose to stay, to learn, to understand. That choice has made us better soldiers than we ever could have been otherwise. Because now we know what war really costs. We know what is at stake when diplomacy fails and weapons are raised. Prolog stepped back from the speaking platform and gestured toward Commander Xerix, who rose from his seat with the dignity of a lifetime of service. The VR commander moved to the platform, his purple wings catching the light. He looked out at the graduates with compound eyes that had seen more conflicts than most of them could imagine. For centuries, Zithri began. The coalition has been cautious about inviting younger species into our militaries. We believed that primitive civilizations had nothing to teach us. We were certain that our long histories and advanced technologies may superior in all ways. We were wrong. He turned toward the human cadets, and something that might have been admiration flickered in his alien eyes. Humanity has taught us that true strength is not the absence of violence, but the understanding of its cost. They do not hide from their own darkness. They study it. They remember it. They build monuments to their worst moments so that future generations will never forget. And then they choose every single day to be better than their ancestors. Zri faced the crowd again. These humans are not monsters. They are the species that looked into the abyss of their own nature and refused to look away. They carry the weight of their history on their shoulders, not as a burden of shame, but as a sacred responsibility. They remember so that others will not have to suffer what their ancestors suffered. The ceremony continued with the awarding of commissions and the recognition of achievements. When it was finished, the graduates mingled with their families and friends. The formal atmosphere gave way to warmth and celebration. Prolox found himself standing beside Danny Vance, sneered the refreshment tables. The young human was watching the celebration with a quiet smile on his face. I almost quit during the first week, Prolux admitted. When they showed the nuclear bombing, I almost walked out and never came back. Danny nodded slowly. A lot of beings did. Why did you never look away? Prels asked. It was a question that had bothered him for months. During all that footage, the three of you never flinched, never closed your eyes. How? Danny was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft but certain, because looking away is a luxury our ancestors could not afford. They had to face what they did. They had to live with the consequences of their choices. If we look away now, if we pretend it never happened, we might forget why it can never happen again. He turned to face Pelox directly, and Danny was struck by how old the young human's eyes seemed. We carry their memories, Prolox, all of them, the victories and the defeats, the acts of heroism and the acts of cruelty. We carry it all because someone has to. Because forgetting would be a betrayal of everyone who died and everyone who survived. Prolox felt something shift In his understanding, for the first time he truly grasped what humanity was. They were not warriors who glorified battle. They were not pacifists who rejected violence. They were something else entirely. They were witnesses, guardians of memory, keepers of the terrible knowledge that war extracts from those who wage it, and they had joined the coalition not as conquerors or savages, but as teachers. They brought with them 10,000 years of hard-won lessons written in blood and fire. They offered their scars as wisdom. As the graduation celebration continued around them, Perlox looked up at the orange sky of the Prime and thought about the future. The galaxy was vast and full of dangers. New threats would emerge, conflicts would arise. The peace that the coalition had maintained for 3,000 years would be tested again and again. But now the coalition had something it had never had before. It had humanity, a species that understood war in its bones, that carried the weight of its own violent history as both warning and weapon. And in that understanding, Prello realized that galaxy had found not a threat, but a gift. The humans had survived themselves, and now they were here to help everyone else do the same.